My name is Diana. I'm 34 years old, and I'm the chief financial officer of a logistics company that moves $11 million of freight through the Midwest every single month. I was disowned by my own mother over a phone call that lasted 6 minutes. 6 minutes to end 29 years. There's a moment I want to show you first, before I explain how we got there. Picture a conference room with cherrywood paneling and a view of the Cedar Rapids skyline, my mother sitting across from me in a blazer she couldn't afford, sliding a folder toward me with trembling hands, and me saying calmly, "You should have called before you drove 3 hours." I'll tell you exactly what was in that folder later. I'll tell you exactly what she said to me the day she stopped being my mother, too. She looked at me in our kitchen on Willow Creek Drive and said, "You were never the daughter I wanted, Diana. You were just the one I got stuck with." I remember the smell of burnt coffee in that kitchen. I remember every word. But before I get into any of that, if you're watching this, do me a favor. Hit subscribe, drop a like, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now for you. I read every single comment, and I promise you, by the end of a story, you're going to want to talk about it. Let me take you back to where this all started, because none of what happened makes sense unless you understand the house I grew up in. I was born in Marbury Falls, Ohio, a town of about 6,000 people 40 minutes outside Columbus, the kind of place where everyone knew whose porch light was out and whose marriage was in trouble. My father, Gerald, worked at the county water treatment plant for 31 years. My mother, Linda, stayed home, which in our house didn't mean warmth and cookies. It meant she had time to keep score. And the scorekeeping in our family always ran in one direction, toward my younger brother, Tyler. Tyler was born 18 months after me, and from the moment I have any memory of my childhood, he was the son our entire household orbited. I remember being 7 years old, standing in the doorway of my bedroom in a hand-me-down dress 2 sizes too big, watching my mother iron Tyler's soccer uniform on the kitchen table while my school science fair project sat unfinished on the floor because there wasn't time to help me with it that week. I got a participation ribbon that year. Tyler got a birthday party with a rented bounce house the same month for turning 9. By the time I was 12, I understood the rules of the house without anyone explaining them. Tyler's report card went on the refrigerator. Mine went in a drawer. When Tyler broke his arm falling off his bike on Elm Street, my mother took 2 weeks off her part-time job at the fabric store to nurse him. When I broke my wrist at 14, falling during a track meet, my father picked me up from the ER, dropped me at home, and went back to his shift, and my mother's only comment when she got home that night was, "Well, I hope you didn't cost us too much in that emergency room bill." I want to be clear about something, because this isn't a story about a monster. My mother wasn't cruel in dramatic, cinematic ways. She never hit me. She never screamed. What she did was quieter, and in some ways, harder to explain to people later. She made me feel, every single day, like I was a slightly disappointing houseguest in my own family. Tyler got warmth. I got management. By 16, I had a job at the Marbury Falls Dairy Queen, not because I wanted spending money, but because I wanted a place to be that wasn't home. I worked Friday and Saturday nights, save almost everything, and by the time I was applying to colleges at 17, I had $4,300 in a savings account my parents didn't know existed. That number matters. Remember it. I got into Ohio State on a partial academic scholarship, $11,000 a year, renewable, contingent on maintaining a 3.5 GPA. It covered maybe half of what I needed. My father's income was modest. My mother didn't work full-time. I remember sitting at our kitchen table on a Tuesday in April, the acceptance letter in front of me, waiting for someone to say congratulations. My mother looked at the letter, looked at me, and said, "That's a lot of debt for a girl who's not even sure what she wants to do with her life." Tyler, who was 15 at the time and had recently been cut from junior varsity baseball, got a new gaming console that same week, no explanation given, no occasion required. I went to Ohio State anyway. I worked 22 hours a week at a campus coffee shop, kept my grades up, kept the scholarship, and majored in finance because I liked that it was made of numbers and rules, things that didn't play favorites. I graduated in 4 years with just under $19,000 in student loans, which I know sounds like nothing compared to what's coming, but at 21, staring at that number, it felt like a mountain. Here's where the story really starts to turn, though, because you need to understand Aunt Carol before anything else makes sense. Carol was my father's older sister. Never married, no children of her own, and she ran a small accounting practice out of a converted garage in Lancaster, about 40 minutes from Marbury Falls. Carol was the only adult in my childhood who ever asked me a single question about myself, and then actually waited for the answer. She's the one who taught me to read a balance sheet when I was 15, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of chamomile tea and a yellow legal pad, walking me through assets and liabilities like it was a bedtime story. "Money doesn't lie, Diana," she used to say. "People lie. Numbers just sit there and tell you the truth." When I graduated college, Carol was the one who showed up. My parents didn't make the 4-hour drive to Columbus for my graduation ceremony. My mother said Tyler had a baseball tournament that weekend, one he wasn't even starting in, and that we can't be in two places at once. Carol drove down alone, sat in the stands in a folding chair she brought from her own garage, and took me to dinner afterward at a steakhouse where she made me order the most expensive thing on the menu. She told me that night, "You are going to build something real, and nobody in that house is going to know what to do with you when you do." She was right. I took a job at a regional logistics firm in Cincinnati right out of school, starting as a junior financial analyst at $52,000 a year. I want to give you the numbers here, because the numbers are the whole story. Within 3 years, I was promoted to senior analyst, $71,000. At 27, I became the director of financial planning, $98,000. By 29, I was recruited by Heartland Transit Solutions, the company where I still work today, headquartered in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and by 32, I was named Chief Financial Officer, with a base salary of $215,000 plus bonus and equity that, in a good year, pushes my total compensation past $340,000. I bought a house on Willow Creek Drive in Cedar Rapids at 30, a 4-bedroom colonial with a stone chimney and an oak tree in the backyard that I still don't know the age of, paid $412,000 for it, put 20% down from money I'd been saving since that Dairy Queen job. I drove a 5-year-old Honda Accord until I was 31, then bought a Lexus, paid cash, $46,000, because Carol always told me debt on a depreciating asset was a fool's game. Meanwhile, back in Marbury Falls, Tyler's life told a very different story, though nobody in my family ever framed it that way out loud. He dropped out of a community college business program after 3 semesters. He worked on and off at an auto parts store. At 26, he married a woman named Brittany, and my parents took out a $23,000 home equity loan to help pay for the wedding. A wedding I wasn't asked to be in, though I was invited to attend and did, sitting at a table near the back with distant cousins. By 28, Tyler and Brittany had 2 kids and were living in a rental 2 streets over from my parents, and every conversation I had with my mother during those years eventually circled back to Tyler's struggles. His car troubles, his job troubles, his need, always his need. And somewhere in there, quietly, without ever saying it directly, I understood that I had become useful to my family in exactly one way. Not as a daughter they were proud of, as a resource. It started small. A text in October of 2021. "Tyler's transmission went out. Can you send $600? We'll pay you back." I sent it. I didn't ask for it back, and it never came. Then it was $1,200 for a security deposit on a bigger rental for the growing family. Then it was $3,000 because Brittany's parents couldn't help this time. I want to be honest with you. I sent money more than once during those years, not because I felt warmth from my family, but because some old, stubborn part of me still wanted to be the daughter who showed up, even in a family that had never shown up for me. By the spring of 2024, I'd sent a combined total of $27,400 over 3 years. I have every Venmo record. I have every text message. I kept them, the way Carol taught me to keep every receipt, every contract, every promise in writing. "You'll need it someday," she told me once, and I didn't fully understand what she meant until later. Then came March of 2025. I remember the date exactly, March 14th, a Friday, because it was the day before my father's 63rd birthday, and my mother called me at 7:22 in the evening, right as I was pulling leftover pad thai out of my refrigerator after a 12-hour day, closing our Q1 numbers. Her voice had that particular brightness she used when she wanted something, a tone I'd learned to recognize the way you learn to recognize weather before a storm. She told me Tyler and Brittany were buying a house, a modest place in Marbury Falls, $186,000, and they needed a co-signer on the mortgage because Tyler's credit was, in her words, still recovering. She said it like it was a formality. She said, "It's just a signature, Diana. You're not actually paying for anything." She said my father agreed it made the most sense, since I was the one who had the numbers for it. I sat with that phone against my ear for a long moment, looking at the pad thai going cold on my counter, and I thought about every balance sheet Carol had ever shown me, every lesson about assets and liabilities, and what happens when you attach your name to someone else's risk. And I thought about the $27,400 already gone, money I'd never once heard a thank you for beyond a passing text. I said, "No." Just that. One word, flat and clear, no anger in it, because I'd learned by then that anger only gave people something to push back against. My mother went quiet for 3 full seconds. I counted them, and then she said, "Excuse me?" I told her I loved Tyler, that I hoped the house worked out for them, but that I would not be co-signing a mortgage for a debt I had no control over, for a person whose income and spending I had zero visibility into. I told her this was a financial decision, not a family loyalty test. I told her, calmly, that I'd already given more than I should have, and that this was where it stopped. She said, "So you'd let your own brother lose his family's future because you're too selfish to help?" I said, "I'm not letting anything happen. Tyler and Brittany can build their own credit or find another way to buy this house. That's not cruelty. That's a boundary." She hung up on me. That was March 14th. I didn't hear from her again until March 22nd, 8 days later, when she called and asked me to drive the 3 hours to Marbury Falls that weekend so we could talk about this like a family. I want to tell you I had some sense of dread walking into that house, but honestly I didn't. I thought it would be an uncomfortable conversation, the kind I'd had 100 times before, where I'd hold my ground and eventually she'd move on to some other grievance. I had no idea it would be the last time I ever sat in that kitchen as anyone's daughter. I drove down on a Saturday morning, the road still wet from an early spring rain, and pulled into the driveway on Hazel Street at a little past 11. The house smelled the way it always had. Old coffee, dish soap, the faint mildew smell from the basement that nobody had ever fixed. My father was in his recliner in the next room, the television low, not coming in. My mother was at the kitchen table already, and Tyler was there too, arms crossed, standing by the counter instead of sitting, which told me this had been planned as an ambush before I'd even taken my coat off. My mother didn't ease into it. She said, "We've decided that if you're not willing to help this family when it actually needs you, then we don't see the point in you being part of it." I remember feeling strangely still. Not numb exactly, more like the moment right before you step into cold water, when your body goes quiet and alert at the same time. I said, "You're disowning me over a mortgage co-signature." Tyler said, from the counter, not even looking at me, "It's not just this. It's always something with you. You act like you're better than us because you make more money." And my mother said the line I told you about at the start of this. She looked right at me, in that kitchen, under that same buzzing fluorescent light that had watched over every unfair moment of my childhood, and she said, "You were never the daughter I wanted, Diana. You were just the one I got stuck with." Nobody in that room defended me. My father stayed in his recliner. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds, and I want you to understand something. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. Something in me had been bracing for the sentence, I think, for 29 years, and when it finally came, there was almost a strange relief in hearing it said out loud instead of just felt. I said, "Okay." I picked my keys back up off the table. I said, "I hope the house works out for you, Tyler." And I walked out. I drove 3 hours back to Cedar Rapids with the radio off, and I didn't call anyone until I pulled into my own driveway on Willow Creek Drive, under my own oak tree, in front of my own house that I had bought with money nobody in that kitchen had ever helped me earn. Then I called Carol. She picked up on the second ring. I told her everything, start to finish, my voice steady the whole time, and when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Diana, listen to me. You didn't lose a family today. You lost a job you were never getting paid fairly for." Then she said, "Come to Lancaster this weekend. I'll make the tea." If this part of the story is hitting close to home for anyone watching, if you've ever been the reliable one, in a family that never once said thank you, drop a comment and tell me. I want to know I'm not the only one. That night was March 22nd, 2025. I didn't know it yet, but it would be 365 days before I heard from my mother again, and I had no idea that when I finally did, it would come in the form of 91 letters, arriving all at once, in a single cardboard box, on my front porch on Willow Creek Drive. But that part of the story comes later. For now, I want you to understand what the next year of my life actually looked like, because contrary to what my family probably told themselves, I didn't spend it falling apart. Year 1 began quietly, in a way nobody watching my life from the outside would have noticed, because I didn't stop showing up to work, I didn't stop paying my mortgage, I didn't stop existing in any visible way. What changed was smaller and more internal, the constant, low-grade bracing I'd carried my whole life, the part of me always waiting for the next phone call demanding money or explaining why Tyler needed something, simply went quiet. I didn't realize how much space that bracing had taken up until it was gone. Carol became, that first year, the closest thing I had to family in the traditional sense. I drove to Lancaster most Sundays, and we'd sit at her kitchen table with chamomile tea, and she taught me things that had nothing to do with accounting. How to make her mother's pot roast, how to prune the rose bushes along her fence line, how to sit in silence with another person without it feeling like punishment. She never once told me I'd made the wrong choice. She never once suggested I reach out and apologize for a boundary I hadn't done anything wrong to set. At work, that first year, I threw myself into the job in a way that surprised even me. Heartland Transit Solutions was, at the time, a $340 million revenue logistics company serving the Midwest corridor, and I was 2 years into my role as Director of Financial Planning, reporting directly to the CFO, a man named Robert Ashworth who'd been with the company for 19 years. In April of 2025, just weeks after that last conversation in my mother's kitchen, Robert called me into his office and told me the board was restructuring the executive team and that he wanted to recommend me for a newly created position, VP of Financial Strategy, at $165,000 base salary, up from my existing $142,000. I remember sitting across from his desk, nodding, saying all the right things, and feeling something strange underneath the professionalism, a kind of quiet, private satisfaction that had nowhere to go, because there was no family dinner table to bring this news to anymore. I called Carol instead. She cried on the phone, which I'd never heard her do before, and said, "Your father's sister is prouder of you than that whole house ever was." I started the binder that spring, though I didn't call it that yet. I just called it the folder at first. It began simply, almost accidentally. I printed out the text message thread with my mother from March 14th, the one about the mortgage, and put it in a plastic sleeve in a 3-ring binder I'd bought at an office supply store for $6.99. Then I added the Venmo records. Every payment I'd sent Tyler and my parents since 2021, all $27,400 of it, itemized and dated. Then the emails. Then, eventually, the voicemails, which I transcribed and printed, word for word, dated and labeled. Carol had taught me that numbers don't lie, and somewhere in that first year, I started applying that same principle to my own history. If I couldn't trust my family's version of events, I would build my own record, one nobody could argue with later. I didn't know yet that I'd ever need it. I just knew I wanted it to exist. Year 2, 2026, brought the kind of forward motion that made the silence easier to live inside. In January, Heartland's board approved a plan to expand our regional freight network into 3 new states, and I was the one who built the financial model behind it, a $22 million capital expenditure plan with a projected 4-year payback period. By June, the expansion was ahead of projections, and in August, Robert Ashworth announced his retirement, effective the following spring. The board conducted a national search for his replacement. I applied. I was 33 years old, competing against candidates with 20 years more experience than me, and in November of that year, the board offered me the position of Chief Financial Officer at a starting base salary of $215,000, with equity and bonus structures that would eventually push my total compensation past $340,000 a year. I signed the offer letter in Robert's old office, at his old desk, on a Tuesday afternoon in November, and when I called Carol to tell her, she was quiet for a second and then said, "You know what your mother would have said if you told her this, right? She'd have found a way to make it about Tyler needing new tires." We both laughed, but there was something sad underneath it too, the particular grief of knowing exactly how a person would fail you, even in a hypothetical. The silence from Marbury Falls wasn't total during those 2 years, though. It had a pulse to it, faint but present, the way a house settles even when nobody's walking through it. In July of 2025, 4 months after the disownment, I got a text from my father, out of nowhere, that just said, "Hope you're doing all right. Your mother doesn't know I'm texting you." I didn't respond right away. When I did, 3 days later, I wrote back, "I'm doing well, Dad. Thank you for checking." He never texted again after that, not for the rest of that year. In December of 2025, I sent a Christmas card to my parents' address, more out of habit than hope, a simple one with a photo of my house on Willow Creek Drive strung with lights. It came back 3 weeks later, unopened, with "return to sender" written across the front in my mother's handwriting, the same looping cursive she used to sign school permission slips. I put that returned envelope in the binder too. It felt important, somehow, to keep the exact shape of her refusal. In March of 2026, almost exactly a year after the disownment, I got a single text from Brittany, Tyler's wife, someone I'd never had much of a relationship with even before the rupture. It said, "Just so you know, we got the house without you. Tyler's credit was fine." I didn't respond to that one either. I did add it to the folder, though, dated and labeled, because Carol had taught me that even the small, petty messages tell you something true if you save enough of them side by side. If any of you have ever kept a record like that, texts, screenshots, receipts, the small paper trail of a relationship falling apart, tell me in the comments. I think more of us do this than we admit out loud. By the middle of 2026, I'd stopped waiting for the phone to ring. That's the part people don't understand about estrangement from the outside. It's not a wound that stays raw and screaming for years. It scars over. You build a life around the absence the way a tree grows around a fence post, and eventually the shape of your life simply includes the gap instead of straining against it. I dated during those years, briefly, a man named Marcus who worked in supply chain logistics for a competing firm, and though it didn't last past 8 months, he said something to me once that I've never forgotten. We were at dinner, and I mentioned, almost offhand, that I didn't really have family to invite to things anymore, and he said, "Diana, you talk about your job like it's the only place that ever told you that you mattered." I didn't have a response for him that night. I thought about it for weeks afterward. Carol filled some of that gap, but she was 71 years old by 2026, and I knew, in the quiet way you know things you don't want to examine too closely, that I wouldn't have her forever. She'd started slowing down that year. A hip replacement in February, a harder time keeping up with her accounting clients, talk of finally selling the practice. She'd run out of that converted garage for almost 4 decades. I helped her with the sale that summer, used what I knew about business valuation to make sure the buyer, a younger accountant from Lancaster, paid her a fair price, $340,000 for a client list and 39 years of goodwill. She cried again when the deal closed, the second time I'd ever seen her cry, and said, "You did for me what nobody in that family ever did for you. You made sure I wasn't cheated." By the fall of 2026, Heartland's expansion into the 3 new states had pushed our annual revenue past $410 million, and the board approved a stock buyback program alongside a restructuring of executive equity grants, which meant that by the time my 1-year anniversary as CFO approached that November, my net worth, mostly tied up invested equity, the house on Willow Creek Drive, and retirement accounts I'd been maxing out since I was 23, had crossed $1.1 million for the first time in my life. I didn't celebrate it the way you might imagine. I sat in my home office one evening with a glass of wine, looked at the number on the screen, and felt something closer to grim satisfaction than joy. I thought about the girl in the doorway with the unfinished science fair project. I thought, she'd never believe this. I want to be honest about something, because this story isn't really about money, even though the money is part of how it gets told. What I actually built during those 2 years of silence wasn't just a career or a net worth. It was a version of myself that didn't organize its worth around whether my mother approved of it. That took longer to build than the binder did. I still had moments. A Sunday afternoon in October 2026, driving past a turnoff that would have taken me to Marbury Falls, feeling something tighten in my chest that I couldn't fully name, grief, maybe, for a family that had never really existed the way I'd wanted it to. But those moments got further apart. By the end of that second year, I could go weeks without thinking about that kitchen at all. Then, in early December of 2026, almost exactly 21 months after I'd walked out of my mother's house for the last time, a regional business journal called the Corridor Business Ledger ran a feature story on Heartland Transit Solutions expansion, part of a broader piece on rising executives in Midwest logistics. It included a photo of me standing in front of our Cedar Rapids headquarters, my title printed clearly beneath my name, Diana Whitfield, Chief Financial Officer, along with a paragraph mentioning the company's revenue growth and my role in engineering the multi-state expansion. The article ran online on December 3, 2026, and it was the kind of piece that would ordinarily disappear into the internet within days, read by a few thousand people in the regional business community and forgotten. Except that a woman named Pamela Higgins, who'd gone to high school with my mother in Marbury Falls 30 years earlier and still followed her on Facebook, saw the article shared in a local community group, recognized my name, and sent my mother a message that read, "Linda, isn't this your daughter? Look how well she's doing," along with a screenshot of the article and my photo. I didn't know any of this had happened at the time. I found out much later exactly how the message had traveled, who had seen it, what had been said in response, because by then I had learned to build a record of everything, and eventually, that record would include this too. But in December of 2026, all I knew was that my phone, which had been quiet for 21 months, was about to start ringing again, and this time, it wouldn't be my father, texting in secret, hoping I was doing all right. The first sign that something had shifted came on December 9, 2026, 6 days after the Corridor Business Ledger article went live. I was in my kitchen on Willow Creek Drive, unloading groceries at around 6:40 in the evening, when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I hadn't heard from in 21 months. It was my mother. The message read, "Diana, I saw the article about you. So proud of you, sweetheart. We should talk." I stood there in my kitchen, holding a bag of frozen vegetables, reading that word, sweetheart, a word she had never once used with me in 29 years of being her daughter, and I felt something cold settle into my chest that had nothing to do with the freezer air. I didn't respond that night. I put my phone face down on the counter and finished putting away the groceries, and later, I opened the binder. It had grown to 2 binders by then, and I added a blank divider tab labeled December 2026, because some instinct in me already understood that this was the beginning of a new chapter of documentation, not a reunion. I called Carol that night. She was quieter than usual on the phone, and when I told her what the text said, she was silent for a moment before she said, "Diana, I want you to think very carefully before you respond to anything. Not because I think you can't handle it, because I think you already know exactly what this is, and I don't want you talking yourself out of what you know." She was right, and I did know. But knowing something and watching it unfold in real time are 2 different experiences. Over the following 3 weeks, the contact came in waves, each one a little warmer, a little more elaborate than the last. On December 14th, my mother texted again. "I know things have been hard between us. I think about you all the time. I'd love to see you before the holidays." On December 19th, my father texted for the first time since that single message back in July of 2025. "Your mom really misses you, Diana. We all do. Would love to catch up." On December 23rd, Tyler texted, which surprised me more than either of my parents reaching out, because Tyler had never been the one to initiate anything with me even when we were children. His text read, "Hey sis, hope you're doing good. Saw the article, that's awesome. We should catch up sometime, it's been too long. Sis." He had called me sis exactly 0 times in the 21 months since standing in that kitchen telling me I acted like I was better than everyone. I didn't respond to any of these messages right away. I let them sit, the way Carol had taught me to let numbers sit before I made a decision about what they meant. On January 6, 2027, I finally responded to my mother, a short, neutral message. "I'm glad you saw the article. I'm doing well. I don't think I'm ready to have a full conversation yet, but I appreciate you reaching out. I wanted to see what would come back, and what came back told me everything." She wrote, almost immediately, "I understand, sweetheart. Take your time. But I do think we need to talk soon. There's some family matters that are time-sensitive." Time-sensitive. Not I miss you. Not I was wrong. Time-sensitive, like I was a vendor she needed a signature from. I brought that phrase to Carol the next Sunday, sitting at her kitchen table in Lancaster, and she just looked at me over her tea and said, "There it is." It was in late January that I got the piece of the puzzle I hadn't been looking for, the one that would have made the whole picture obvious even to someone far less careful than I'd become. My cousin Melissa, my mother's sister's daughter, someone I'd stayed loosely in touch with over the years through Facebook, sent me a message on January 24th, 2027, that started with, "I probably shouldn't be telling you this, but I think you deserve to know." She explained that she'd been in a family group chat, one I'd obviously been excluded from, called Whitfield Fam, and that a screenshot had been shared within it that she felt uncomfortable sitting on. She sent me the screenshot directly. It showed a message from my mother, dated January 18th, 2027, sent to the group that included Tyler, Brittany, my father, and my aunt, and it read, "I talked to a lawyer friend of Carol's replacement about this. Apparently, since Diana's not married and doesn't have kids, if something happened to her suddenly, a lot of what she has could end up going through the state, or to that Carol woman instead of family. We need to fix this before it's too late. Tyler, you should be the one to reach out since you two were always closer growing up." I read that message 4 times. Tyler and I had never been close growing up. That single manufactured sentence, sitting there in black and white, was somehow more revealing than everything else combined, because it told me my mother wasn't just angling for money, she was actively rewriting our family history in real time, constructing a version of my childhood that had never existed, in order to get what she wanted. Below that message, Brittany had replied, "Do we know roughly what she's worth? Just so we know what we're working with." My mother had responded, "The article said CFO of a company doing $400 million a year. Has to be significant. Plus the house. I looked it up on Zillow. $480,000 estimated value now." I sat in my home office that night with my laptop open, that screenshot enlarged on my screen, and I felt something I want to describe honestly, because I think people expect these moments to feel like devastation, and it didn't. It felt like clarity. It felt like finally being handed the missing page of a book I'd been reading my whole life, the page that explained why every chapter before it had felt slightly wrong. I printed the screenshot. I added it to the binder, dated, labeled, Whitfield Fam Group Chat, January 18th, 2027, obtained via Melissa Ruiz, forwarded January 24th, 2027. Carol had always told me that the truth doesn't need decoration. It just needs a place to sit where nobody can later claim it never existed. The following week, I did something I probably should have done back in 2025. I called an attorney. Her name was Patricia Kessler, a state and family law attorney with an office in downtown Cedar Rapids who Robert Ashworth, my predecessor, had recommended to me years earlier for an unrelated matter. I sat across from her mahogany desk on February 3rd, 2027, and laid out the situation, the disownment, the silence, the sudden reconnection, the group chat screenshot, the lawyer friend my mother claimed to have consulted. Patricia listened without much visible reaction, the way I imagine good attorneys learn to do, and then she said something that clarified my legal position more than anything else could have. She explained that without a will, and given that I wasn't married and had no children, a portion of my estate could indeed pass to my parents under Iowa's intestate succession laws if something happened to me. Not all of it, and not automatically to Tyler as my mother's message implied, but enough to explain exactly why this had suddenly become time-sensitive. She also explained something I hadn't fully considered, that my mother's reference to a lawyer friend was almost certainly either a bluff or, at most, a single consultation with someone who'd given her surface-level information she was now using to manufacture urgency. "This is a common pattern," Patricia told me, tapping her pen against a legal pad. "Families that estrange someone successful often resurface once they learn what that person is actually worth, and they usually do it under the guise of legal necessity, because it creates pressure without requiring them to apologize for anything." I left Patricia's office that day and did exactly what she recommended. I drafted a will, formalized a trust structure for my primary assets, and named Carol as executor, along with a charitable beneficiary designation for a portion of my estate that would go to a scholarship fund for first-generation college students, something Patricia and I discussed together, inspired by my own $11,000 a year scholarship that had felt like a lifeline back when I was 17. The full estate planning package cost me $4,200 in legal fees, finalized on February 14, 2027, Valentine's Day, which felt like a strange, almost funny coincidence at the time, signing papers that protected me from my own family on a day designated for love. It was 3 weeks later, in early March of 2027, that Tyler showed up at my house unannounced. I hadn't given anyone my address. I'd moved once since the Disowned, from my first house to the one on Willow Creek Drive, and none of my family had ever seen it in person. But Zillow listings are public, and apparently curiosity, or motive, is a powerful research tool, because on a Saturday afternoon, March 6, 2027, at around 2:15 in the afternoon, my doorbell rang, and when I looked through the front window, I saw Tyler's truck in my driveway, and Tyler himself standing on my porch in a jacket I didn't recognize, looking up at the house with an expression I can only describe as assessing. I opened the door. I didn't hug him. I said, "Tyler, this is a surprise." He smiled, that same easy smile he'd had his whole life, the one that had gotten him out of trouble with our mother 1,000 times growing up, and said, "I was in the area. Thought I'd stop by, see how you're doing. This place is really nice, Diana." He said it while looking past me into the front hallway, at the hardwood floors, at the staircase, at the crown molding I'd had installed the year before for $8,600. I let him in, mostly because I wanted to see exactly what this was going to look like up close, the way you'd let a stranger walk through a room you already know they're casing. He asked to see the kitchen. He commented on the granite countertops. He asked, almost offhand, "So is this place paid off, or you still got a mortgage on it?" I told him that wasn't really something I discussed, and he laughed and said, "Fair enough, just curious, wondering how the other half lives." He asked what car was in the garage. He asked, at one point, whether I had a will, framing it as casual concern. "Mom and Dad worry about you not having anyone to take care of things if something happened, since you're not married." And I recognized, almost with a kind of tired amusement, that he was reciting a line, possibly one my mother had coached him through before he came. He stayed for 40 minutes. Before he left, standing on my porch again, he said, "Mom really wants to see you, Diana. She's been different since the article came out. I think she really gets it now, how successful you've become." I told him I appreciated him stopping by, and I watched his truck pull out of my driveway, and I went back inside and sat down at my kitchen table and wrote down, from memory, every question he'd asked, every comment he'd made, timestamped as best I could reconstruct it. I added it to the binder that night, labeled Tyler Visit, March 6, 2027, unannounced, Asset Inquiry Pattern. If you've ever had a family member show up out of nowhere right after you started doing well, and you just knew, somewhere in your gut, exactly why they were really there, tell me in the comments. I think this is one of the most common experiences in this whole story, and I don't think enough people talk about how disorienting it is to watch someone you grew up with turn into an appraiser in your own home. By mid-March, the picture was complete enough that I stopped needing any more confirmation. My mother wasn't reaching out because she'd had some revelation about how she treated me. She'd learned, through a stranger's Facebook message, that her estranged daughter had become a chief financial officer worth over $1 million, and she had spent the following months constructing a narrative to herself, to Tyler, to whatever lawyer she'd half consulted, in which reconciliation was really just risk management, a way of making sure that whatever I had would eventually flow back toward the family that had discarded me in a kitchen on Hazel Street 2 years earlier. Patricia and I met again on March 20th, 2027, and she helped me think through what I actually wanted out of any eventual conversation with my mother, separate from the legal protections already in place. "You don't owe them an audience," she told me. "But if you want one on your terms, that's different from letting them ambush you again." I told her I did want one, eventually, not because I believed anything would change, but because some part of me needed to see it through, needed my mother to say whatever she'd come to say out loud in front of me, so I could finally close the book with my eyes open instead of just walking away a second time without ever hearing the full pitch. I decided that week that I would invite my mother to my house, not the other way around, not neutral territory, not a place where she could control the environment the way she always had growing up. My house, my kitchen, my terms. I told Carol about the plan on a Sunday in late March, and she reached across her kitchen table and took my hand, something she rarely did, and said, "You've spent 2 years building a life that doesn't need her approval. Whatever she says when she walks through your door, remember that you already won. This conversation isn't going to determine your worth. It's just going to determine whether she's capable of seeing it. I sent the text on April 2nd, 2027. I'll host dinner at my house. April 12th, 6 p.m. You, Dad, and Tyler are welcome to come. I think it's time we talk everything through. My mother responded within 11 minutes. We'll be there. Thank you, sweetheart. This means so much to us. I spent the 10 days between that text and the dinner doing something I hadn't fully realized I needed to do. I organized both binders, front to back, chronologically, from the earliest Venmo receipt in 2021 through Tyler's visit in March, cross-referencing dates, making sure every piece of evidence said exactly where it needed to sit if I ever needed to reach for it. I didn't know, walking into that week, exactly how I'd use it, or if I'd need to at all. But Carol's voice was in my head the whole time, the way it had been since I was 15 years old at her kitchen table. Numbers don't lie. People lie. And on April 12th, 2027, at 6 p.m., I was going to find out exactly how far my family was willing to lie to my face. At 5:47 p.m. on April 12th, 13 minutes before they were due to arrive, I set the binders on the sideboard in my dining room, within reach but not yet visible, poured myself a single glass of water, and stood at my front window watching for headlights to turn onto Willow Creek Drive. At 6:03 p.m., headlights swung into my driveway. I watched from the front window as my mother's car, my father's actually, an older Buick he'd had for a decade, came to a stop behind Tyler's truck, which had pulled in a minute earlier. I'd asked them all to come at the same time, and apparently, for once in their lives, they had coordinated. I opened the door before they reached it. My mother was wearing a blazer I didn't recognize. Navy blue, slightly too structured for her frame, the kind of thing you buy for an important meeting rather than a family dinner. My father looked older than I remembered, more stooped, his hair fully gray now. Tyler hung back near the porch steps, and Brittany wasn't with him. Just as well, I thought, since this was never really about her. Diana! My mother's voice was warm in a way that felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced the tone in the car. She stepped forward like she might hug me, and I stepped back just enough to make clear that wasn't happening yet, gesturing instead toward the door. Come in. Dinner's ready. I'd made a simple meal, roast chicken, roasted vegetables, a salad. Nothing elaborate, because I hadn't cooked this dinner to impress anyone. We sat at my dining room table, the binders still on the sideboard, unremarked upon, and for the first 20 minutes, the conversation stayed almost unbearably normal. My mother asked about my job. My father asked about the house. Tyler talked about his kids, about a promotion he'd gotten at the auto parts store, moving from associate to assistant manager, an extra $3 an hour. It was my mother who finally shifted the tone, setting her fork down with a small, deliberate clink against the plate, folding her hands in front of her the way she used to when she was about to deliver a lecture. Diana, I want to say something, and I want you to really hear it. She looked at me with an expression I remembered from childhood, the one she used right before asking me to give something up for Tyler. I know things have been hard between us. I've had a lot of time to think, and I realize now how much you've accomplished, and I'm proud of you. Truly. Thank you, I said, and I meant it as neutrally as it sounded. She continued, her voice softening further, almost performing tenderness. But I also think it's time we started acting like a family again. Real family doesn't hold grudges forever. And I think, given everything you've built, it would mean so much to your father and me, and to Tyler, if we could find a way to be part of that. Maybe help each other out, the way families are supposed to. There it was. Not an apology. Not an acknowledgement of the kitchen on Hazel Street, of the 29 years before it, of the $27,400 of the returned Christmas card. Just an invitation back into the role I'd always played, resource, safety net, checkbook with a pulse. What does help each other out mean exactly? I asked, keeping my voice even. Tyler jumped in before my mother could answer, leaning forward with that same easy smile from my porch in March. Look, Diana, I'm not going to dance around it. Brittany and I are underwater on some stuff. The house needs a new roof. We've got about $14,000 in credit card debt, and honestly, with everything you've got going on, it wouldn't even be a dent for you. We're not asking for a handout. We're asking for family to be family. My father, who had said almost nothing the entire dinner, finally spoke, his voice quieter than Tyler's, almost apologetic in tone but not in substance. Your mother and I are also thinking about retirement. The county pension isn't what we thought it'd be. We were hoping, maybe, you could help us look at refinancing the house, or maybe even just gifting us something to get current on a few things. I let the silence sit for a moment after he finished, long enough that I watched my mother's practiced warmth start to flicker at the edges, uncertain what my quiet meant. Then I stood up, walked to the sideboard, and picked up the first binder. I set it on the table in front of me, not slid toward anyone, just sat down, the way you place a fact in a room. Before we talk about any of that, I said, I want to show you something. I opened to the first tab and turned it so they could see. The text message from March 14th, 2025, the one about co-signing Tyler's mortgage. My mother's face changed almost imperceptibly. I turned the page to the Venmo records, all $27,400 of it, dated and itemized, money sent between 2021 and early 2025 with no repayment, no thanks beyond a passing text. I turned to the returned Christmas card, the return to sender, in my mother's own handwriting, still tucked in its plastic sleeve. Diana, what is this? My mother said, her voice tighter now. This is the last 4 years, I said. I kept it because I learned a long time ago that if I didn't write things down, I'd spend the rest of my life being told a version of events that wasn't true. I turned to the next page, the printed screenshot of the Whitfield fam group chat, my mother's message about the lawyer friend, about intestate succession, about Carol, about the article and the $400 million company and the Zillow estimate on my house. The room went very still. Tyler's easy smile was gone entirely now, replaced by something closer to panic. My mother stared at the page for a long moment and then said, quietly, Melissa had no business sending you that. That's what you're focused on, I said. Not that you sent it, just that I saw it. It's not what it looks like, she said, but her voice had lost its earlier warmth entirely, gone brittle and defensive. We were worried about you, Diana. About what would happen to everything if something happened to you, with no husband, no kids. You were worried about where my money would go, I said, and I kept my voice level because I'd promised myself, driving home from Hazel Street 2 years earlier, that I would never again let this family see me lose my composure in that kitchen or any other. You didn't reach out because you missed me. You reached out because a woman from your high school sent you a Facebook article, and 6 days later I had a text calling me sweetheart for the first time in my life. My father shifted in his chair, looking down at the table, and for the first time all evening, said something that sounded less rehearsed. Linda, maybe we should. No, my mother said sharply, cutting him off, and then, turning back to me, her composure cracking further. You want to sit there and act like the victim, Diana, but you have always made yourself hard to love. Even as a little girl, you were cold, calculating, always keeping score. I learned to keep score, I said, because you taught me, every single day, that love in this family was conditional and unevenly distributed. I didn't invent the scoreboard. I just finally learned to read it. Tyler stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against my hardwood floor. This is unbelievable. We came here in good faith, and you're ambushing us with a folder like we're on trial. Nobody ambushed you, I said. I told you exactly why I wanted to have dinner. I said it was time we talked everything through. This is what talking everything through looks like when one side has actually been honest the whole time. My mother's hands were trembling now, and I want to be honest, there was a flicker of something in her face in that moment that wasn't performance, wasn't strategy. It was fear, real and unguarded, the kind of fear that comes when someone realizes the story they've been telling themselves has just been laid out flat on a table in front of them, undeniable. Diana, she said, and her voice cracked slightly, quieter now, almost lost. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be the mother you needed. I never did. I don't think I ever knew how. For a moment, just a moment, I felt something soften in my chest, some old, tired hope flickering back to life, because that sentence, unlike everything before it, sounded true. But then, almost as quickly as it came, she straightened her shoulders, wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand, and the defensiveness slid back into place like a mask returning to its hook. But that doesn't mean you get to humiliate us over dinner with a scrapbook of grievances. This isn't fair, Diana. We're your family. You keep saying that word like it means something you've actually shown me, I said. Family isn't a title. It's a pattern of behavior. And the pattern here has been consistent for 29 years. I closed the binder. I didn't need it open anymore. It had said what it needed to say. I looked at each of them in turn. My father, still staring at the table, unable to meet my eyes. Tyler, arms crossed, jaw tight, unwilling to concede anything. My mother, breathing hard, somewhere between fury and something that might, in a different woman, have become grief. I'm not going to co-sign anything, I said. I'm not going to gift anyone money. I'm not going to refinance my father's house. I built what I have without this family's help, most of the time despite this family's choices, and I'm not going to spend the next 30 years funding a version of us that only exists when you need something from me. So that's it, my mother said. You're just going to cut us off again, after everything. I'm not cutting you off, I said. You did that in your kitchen 2 years ago when you told me I was never the daughter you wanted. I'm simply not opening the door back up to the same arrangement. If any of you ever want a relationship with me that isn't built around what I can give you, I'm here. But that has to be real, and it has to come without a folder of its own hidden agenda. Tyler grabbed his jacket off the back of his chair. This was a waste of time, he muttered, and walked out without another word, the front door closing hard behind him. My father stood slowly, looked at me for a long moment, something apologetic in his eyes that he still couldn't quite turn into words, and said quietly, I'm sorry, Diana. For all of it. I should have said something a long time ago. Then he followed Tyler out to the car. My mother stayed a moment longer, standing at the table, looking at the binder, at me, at the house around her that she'd only ever seen through Tyler's assessing report back in March. You think you've won something, she said finally, sitting here with your folders and your big house. But you're alone, Diana. All this, and you're still alone. Maybe, I said. But I'm alone with the truth, instead of surrounded by people who need me to keep lying to myself. I'll take that trade. She left without saying goodbye. I stood at my window and watched the Buick's taillights disappear down Willow Creek Drive, and I felt, in the quiet that followed, not triumph exactly, but something steadier, the particular relief of a door finally closing all the way, instead of being left slightly, agonizingly ajar for years. I want to tell you what happened after that, because this story doesn't end with a slam door. In the months that followed, my father started texting again, quietly, the way he had back in 2025. Small things, a photo of a bird at his feeder, a question about how work was going. I answered most of the time. In October of that year, he told me, in a text sent late at night, that he'd started attending a grief support group at his church, and that some of what he'd been working through there was about me, about the ways he'd stayed silent for 3 decades while my mother built the house we grew up in around Tyler's needs. I didn't know what to do with that information except to let it exist, the way I'd let so many other things exist in that binder, without forcing it into forgiveness before it was ready. Tyler and my mother, I heard through Melissa, eventually did manage the roof repair on their own, taking out a personal loan at a higher interest rate than I would have offered, and I felt nothing about that except a quiet, distant sense that some debts really do have to be paid by the people who incurred them. Carol passed away 11 months after that dinner, peacefully, in her sleep, at 72 years old. I was the one who handled her estate, exactly as she'd planned, and in her will, she left me a small wooden box that had sat on her kitchen table for as long as I could remember. Inside it was every letter I'd ever written her as a child, save for nearly 3 decades, along with a note in her handwriting that read, You were never the one anybody got stuck with, Diana. You were the one worth keeping. I think about that note more than almost anything else from these 2 years. So here's what I want to leave you with, because I know a lot of you watching this have your own version of this story, your own kitchen, your own folder, your own family member who only found their way back to you after they found out what you were worth. I don't think the lesson here is that money makes you untouchable, or that keeping receipts is some kind of revenge fantasy. I think the real lesson is quieter than that. Somewhere along the way, I stopped needing my mother's approval to know my own worth, and that shift, not the salary, not the house, not the binder, is what actually let me sit at that table and stay calm while everything I'd built finally spoke for itself. You don't have to earn the love that was supposed to be free. You just have to stop waiting for people to give it, and start building a life solid enough that their absence doesn't collapse it. If this story meant something to you, I'd love for you to subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because there's always a next one in this world, isn't there? Drop a comment and let me know which part hit you the hardest. And if you've got your own version of a story, share it, because I read every single one of them, and I promise you're never as alone in this as it feels. Until next time, take care of yourselves and keep your own folder. You'll need it someday.